Okay, and then I would like to officially welcome all of you today. And it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Julie Golomb. Julie is a professor in the Department of Psychology and the Center for Cognitive and Brain Sciences and the Neuroscience Graduate Program at Ohio State University. She's also the director of the Cognitive Neuroscience area and the PhD program. She received her Bachelor of Science in Neuroscience from Brandeis University, working with Ard Wingfield and Mike Kahana. Her PhD in Neuroscience from Yale University, working with Marvin Chun and Jamie Mazer, and was a postdoctoral research fellow with Nancy Canvisher at MIT before she joined the faculty at Ohio State in 2012. She has already won multiple early career awards. I will just name a few that includes the Sloan Research Fellow in Neuroscience, the APA Distinguished Scientific Award for Early Career Contribution to Psychology, and the Federation of Associations in Behavioral and Brain Sciences Early Career Impact Award. Her lab studies the interactions between visual attention, memory, perception, and eye movements using both behavioral measures, neuroimaging, and computational analyses. And today, as you can already see here, she will talk to us about attention, memory, and perception, and specifically how they interact under dynamic conditions. So we're really excited to have the opportunity to hear from you today. So yeah, thank you so much, Julie, for joining us, and the stage is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for the lovely introduction. Excited to be here and see all of you, including some familiar faces and old lab mates. Hi, Sarah. Um, yeah, so I hear you guys are a pretty broad group, so feel free if anything is unclear to interrupt me with questions either throughout or at the end as well. Um, okay, and you guys can hear me and see the screen okay and everything. It's always harder over Zoom to gauge. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Excellent. So overall, work in my lab and really the underlying question that's just fascinated me since I got into the field is how does our visual system make sense of the world around us? The input to our visual system is just this really sparse, rudimentary dots of light at different wavelengths that are hitting our retina in different patterns. And yet somehow we're able to have these really rich perceptual experiences where we can just instantaneously and seemingly effortlessly perceive these scenes and the content of it and act within them. And all of that just built up from a really complex process. And I think one of the things that has always struck me about this process is that it feels effortless almost. So as we are perceiving the world around us, we're not really aware of all the complicated stuff going on in our visual systems that gets us there. And so work in my lab has focused on a number of issues and topics related to this idea of how is it that we can so seemingly effortlessly perform or perceive a rich and integrated visual experience. So we look at questions related to how we perceive things, both in terms of behavior as well as neural representations, the role of attention and working memory, and dynamic contexts such as eye movements and shifts of attention and so forth. And so we look at this in my lab using a combination of behavioral, neuroimaging, and model-based analyses. And one of the things that we've really started exploring in more detail over recent years, which is part of what I'm going to talk about today, is the idea that, you know, these cognitive processes, when we think about perception, attention, working memory, they're not silos. They don't all just, proceed independently. But in the brain, they're all constantly interacting. And so some of the stuff that I'll tell you about today is some of our work over the past several years looking at some of these different interactions and ways that attention in particular can interact with perception and working memory, particularly under more dynamic scenarios. So let's start with attention. So what happens when we pay attention to something? We know that we need attention. The world is too complex to process everything at once. So when we can attend to different parts of the scene, we can attend to different locations or features or sensory modalities and so forth. And so when we attend to a particular aspect of our environment, we're going to see neural facilitation. So whatever you're attending to, the neurons that are sensitive to that type of information is going to be facilitated. But importantly, that also causes boosts to attention and action and memory. So when you're paying attention to something, you might perceive it as higher contrast. You might be able to act faster towards it. And also, interestingly, you're also more likely to remember it. So, for example, if you were in this real world scene where you were driving, um, and let's say in one case there's a kid just safely on the sidewalk, and in another case there's a kid crossing right in front of you. You're going to pay more attention, obviously, hopefully, to the stimulus right in front of you. And because that captures your attention and is something that you're paying attention to, not only are you going to process it better, but subsequently you might be more likely to say, remember that you saw a child wearing a red coat than if it was off to the side. So we've started, as I mentioned, looking into these questions of, well, how do attention, perception, and memory interact? And so if we dig in a little more to these different functions of attention, so in this case, I'm going to primarily, I should preface this by saying, uh, at least for today, I'm going to talk about visual attention and particularly visual spatial attention. So let's say, what are some of the things that happen if you are focusing your spatial visual attention at a particular location in the scene? So, as I mentioned, we know that it's going to facilitate your processing at the focus of attention. It's going to enhance your visual perception. As I said, things that are at the focus of attention are going to be perceived as higher resolution or higher contrast. Um, but the benefits of attention go beyond just the sort of enhancing contrast and facilitation. Spatial attention has also been shown to, or speculated to serve as the glue for object feature binding. So if you have lots of different objects in the world, paying attention helps you sort of know, okay, here's my coffee mug and, this is purple and, mug, and here's the phone that's, black in a different shape. And so paying attention helps you bind the different features of an object together so we don't constantly get mixed up about things. And also, as I mentioned, attention can gate working memory encoding. So things that you are paying attention to, you are more likely to subsequently encode. If you are not paying attention to something in the first place, you're much less likely to encode it into working memory. And just even more generally, the things that are in the focus of your spatial attention and just having focused attention helps you filter out task irrelevant information. And so when you're paying attention to things, you're filtering out other things that are less relevant and can be distracting. So one of the things, though, that has struck us in recent years is that everything that I've been talking about so far, it's been framed as, okay, these are the benefits of attention. And so when attention is focused, and that's largely how the field has often thought about this is, okay, when you have focused attention is good. And when your attention is focused, you get all these benefits. But in the real world, there's often more than one thing that we could or should be paying attention to. And so having a single focus of attention is not realistic and not necessarily the ideal context that we want to be in. And so what's happening when there's more than one thing? And so we've been exploring in my lab lots of different types of dynamic attention. So, for example, in the real world, when we're exploring scenes and behaving in the world, we're constantly making eye movements, shifting our eyes around to pay attention to different things. Even when our eyes are not moving, we are focusing our covert or internal attention, might be shifting to different locations or to dividing our attention. Maybe there are multiple things we want to pay attention to at once. Um, but also our attention is dynamic in unintentional ways as well. So we might be trying to pay attention to one thing, but something distracting happens in another location. Or we may be trying to pay attention but have lapses in attention, and so forth. And not only might we have these dynamic types of external attention of shifting between items that we're paying attention to in the external environment, but we're also constantly shifting our internal priorities and our attention towards working memories or rules or thinking about, different tasks and so forth. And so, our world is very dynamic. And one of the things that I think we've been coming along and highlighting this idea of attention is that one way you can think about attention is as this balancing act that's sort of constant and dynamically shifting between weights of things at different levels. So you might be attending to, shifting attention between different spatial locations or different items in the world. You might be shifting attention between, different memories in your head, but you also might be going back and forth between external and internal attention as well. And so we're constantly having these dynamic, um, very rapid changes and shifts in attention. And so this led us to think, well, if we know that all of these benefits here happen when attention is focused, then might there be widespread consequences when the attentional focus is disrupted in these more dynamic scenarios? So I'm going to talk today about one particular type of dynamic scenario, attentional capture. So this is the case where you get distracted by something salient in the environment, and that captures your attention away from a focus. And so what I'll talk about today is a series of studies that we've been doing over the past few years, showing that when your attention gets captured away, that this dynamic attention can affect feature perception. It can also disrupt filters gaining working memory and more broadly cognitive control and neural processing of task relevant features. And then hopefully, if there's time at the end, I'll share a little bit about some recent work using EEG to try to reconstruct the neural representations of attention during dynamic scenarios. Okay, so attentional capture. So again, this is this idea that what happens when attention is captured by a salient distractor. This is the lovely, decades old meme now of what happens in the real world. In the lab, we study it more like this. So let's say can you guys see my mouse, by the way, when I move it? Okay, great. So let's say you were doing a task where there are a bunch of letters in these boxes and you have to report the identity of the letter in the box that's framed in white. So this would be your target one. But then there's some distractor that appears in a different location. So you can ask, what happens if your attention is captured by that salient distractor? And there are decades of research showing all sorts of consequences of this spatial attention capture. So you might make eye movements over to that. Even if you were required to stay fixated and didn't make eye movements, your covert attention might shift there. And so that might result in slower reaction times performing the target task or maybe poorer accuracy on the target task and so forth. But as I mentioned, we became interested in these broader consequences. And so we started wondering, well, what else might happen when you're captured by a distractor? And so in the first set of studies we did, we decided to look at feature perception and maybe a little more subtly. So instead of having this task where you're just reporting, a letter that can be correct or incorrect, we would have participants report the color using a continuous color wheel. So they would have to do something like report the color of an object in the target test, and I'll show you an example in a minute, while in some trials they may be distracted by another color. And so what we wanted to know was not just, going beyond these slowing down or reductions in accuracy, is the presence of a distractor, might that actually have more inherent consequences for what someone is perceiving as the target? So this is, let me show you a demo of a task. So this is a task, it's slowed down to 1/10 of the speed. And I'm going to first show you a couple trials of a task without a distractor, just to walk you through the task. Okay, so it appears one of them is the thicker line, that's the target. So then, let me just pause this for a sec. So basically they would see, I'll go back, you see the target, and then they move the mouse to correct the target color. So let me get back here. Okay. So they see the target one, then on the color wheel, they click on the correct target that they remember, and then they can highlight a confidence interval for how confident they are. So here's another trial, another target, and then they click on the color they remember as being the target color. And then again, they can give the confidence interval as well. So that first click is the color that they are reporting. And so that is an example of a neutral condition. So they would do a bunch of these trials intermixed. So they're always looking for the target is the one in the thick white border. And they're always going to report the color that had appeared at that target location. The critical condition is this invalid condition, where I'll show you an example in a minute, where on some trials, this set of distractor dots flashes briefly, so it's an abrupt onset. The task is still to report the target color here. And then on some trials, that salient cue can appear at the target location as well. So the salient cue could either help or hurt you or not be present at all. So let me show you an example of an invalid cue. And so again, this is slowed down, and I'm telling you that there's going to be a distractor in this case. But still, you want to try to focus on the target color. And I've gotten rid of the confidence report just for sake of simplicity. Okay, so I'm guessing that even though I told you there was going to be a distractor and I warned you about it and it was slow, you were probably still captured by that. And some of you probably on the first one was like, wait, it should be that other color that was there. So it really is a pretty salient cue that really does capture your attention away to that distractor item. Let me show you. Here's an example of the valid task. So you can see how much easier it is when the salient cue attracts your attention toward the target itself. Okay, so that's the basic task. During the task, they do hundreds of these, and they're all intermixed, so they don't know whether it'll be a distractor or a no distractor task. And again, the actual task is sped up much faster than that, so they really have to process these very quickly, and they can do it pretty well. So they get used to it with a bit of practice, and so. What we do and why we use this color wheel is the advantage is that on every trial, we get a measure of exactly what color they clicked on. And so we can then plot this as a histogram of their responses based on where they clicked and how much error that is compared to the correct color. So what you see on the neutral and the valid ones are, these nice tight Gaussian-like distributions around zero error. So subjects are pretty good at this task. In the invalid task, they are getting it right most of the time, so they are still able to do it. But you can already kind of see before I show you the actual errors that they are making more errors in this task. So to actually analyze this, we use probabilistic mixture modeling analysis, where we fit these distributions with a mixture model, which is basically saying we're going to try to take this actual histogram of responses, and we're going to find the best fitting model that is a combination of Gaussian around the correct target responses. Plus, you could have misreport one. So if they misreport one of the other colors in the display, as well as random guessing, so like a uniform distribution. So we can look at this, and then that allows us to quantify things in these different conditions. So some general indicators of performance, like their likelihood of random guessing or the standard deviation, the precision that they're able to report the colors. But we can also get these systematic errors like swap errors, which is when if they were to misreport one of the other items, one of the non-target items in the display, as well as feature distortions, we can actually look at more subtle shifts. And I'll explain these in a minute. So these are our results. We just ran two pretty identical experiments here. And this is just showing that for these standard performance measures, this is exactly what you would expect based on previous studies. So salient capture impairs performance. So if you were to look at like the probability of guessing from the valid to the neutral to the invalid, and the standard deviation, so the precision, so they both get less precise in their responses and they make more random guesses in this invalid condition where they're captured. That's not too exciting or new. What's interesting is when we look at these more systematic errors. And so one of the things that we see are a pretty substantial amount of swap errors. So trials on which they are reporting one of the other colors in the display. So let's say the color they're supposed to be reporting is green. Um, and what you can see here is this bar here is trials on which they were reporting the color at the salient Q instead of the correct target. And you can see that they do that a lot more than the adjacent other color in the display. That's the control color that's sort of an equal distance in both physical space as well as in perceptual space around the color wheel. So on a decent portion of trials, when their attention is captured, they are making these errors. Um, and these are really big errors that they're making. They're outright reporting the wrong color. One of the most striking things about it, though, is that when they make these big swap errors, they're actually doing it with like really high confidence that they're correct. So they're not really aware that they're making an error when they do this. And so that's where those confidence reports come in. I won't show you this data in the interest of getting to the other tasks, but essentially most of the time, if they make errors, like if they make a random guess or if they were to, report one of these other ones on a certain trial, they know they're wrong and their confidence will show that. But when they misreport that distractor item's color, they think they're doing the target and their confidence is just as high as on the target tasks. So that's thing one is they make these really big errors with high confidence. But the other really cool thing is that on other trials, when they are mostly getting it correct, so trials where they are reporting, something in the greenish, we actually see evidence for a more subtle type of error. And that means that on average, those correct responses are actually not perfectly centered on 0-degree error. They're actually systematically shifted. And in this case, they're shifted away from that distractor color. So let me visualize what this means. So let's say the target color was this greenish color here, and let's say the salient distractor was the purple color. So if they made, a correct response would be reporting something greenish on this trial. A swap error would be reporting something purplish. The repulsion errors, what they're basically doing is these are trials where they are reporting something greenish, but it's actually being slightly shifted away systematically and then significantly shifted away from the salient distractor. So it's as if they're avoiding that salient distractor. And so we interpret these trials as, you know, trials where even on trials where they weren't fully captured by it and they still know what the correct color is they're supposed to report, they're still influenced by that salient distractor. And it's like they're actively trying to not report that color and sort of it's still infiltrating the responses in a sense and affecting what color they are perceiving. So this is suggesting that, attentional capture by a salient distractor, it's not only inducing this spatial shift of attention, it also seems to be altering feature perception in these striking ways. And so again, we see these two types of feature errors. One is these large pronounced swaps that they're falsely confident in. But then we also have these more subtle errors where the subjects are successfully resisting capture, but their feature reports are still subtly distorted by that item that they were trying to suppress. And in subsequent studies, we've used this to try to gain insight into the mechanisms and spatiotemporal dynamics of attentional capture. And we see things like these two types of feature interference error vary over the time course of attentional capture and disengagement. So basically, you see some go up at you see the larger ones when you're immediately captured at a little later in the time course when you've had more time to suppress it. You can see more of the repulsion errors. We've also shown that these different types of errors can be mitigated by learned suppression. And we've also been looking more recently in a slightly different context at things like reward and motivation and showing some interesting effects that these two types of feature errors might be differentially sensitive to your motivation and incentivization in that. And then I'll put in a brief plug as well for this paradigm. So I mentioned we've been doing these sort of tasks. We've been studying in my lab in lots of different dynamic paradigms. And so it turns out that even outside the context of distraction, we find these characteristic patterns of feature binding errors. So one pattern where we see these large feature swapping errors seem to be characteristic any type of task where you are shifting attention from one location to another, and maybe don't have time to complete the shift, or you have some distracting shift. And in these types of tasks, we sometimes can do it with multiple features as well. And we'll find that, if you get sucked to one of the other items, you will be likely to swap. If it's a color and orientation, you would swap both the color and the orientation. So outright reporting the other items. But in other contexts, we see more of these distortion errors. And these distortion errors, where it's sort of a more subtle mixing or repulsion, we tend to find in contexts where you're simultaneously having attention in two different locations. And so we've looked at this, finding these characteristic errors across all sorts of other dynamic cases. So the attentional capture by salient distractors, but we've also looked at this in the case of remapping across eye movements, and other types of, spatial lapses and probability guided internal working memory shifts and things like that. So we think it's a really useful paradigm to try to not only say, hey, like there are these really interesting perceptual errors that can occur under cases of dynamic attention, but going further, the specific pattern of errors that you do get can give you insight as to what's actually happening at, you know, in terms of like the spatiotemporal dynamics of what's actually happening with those dynamic scenarios and how attention is shifting. And I'll get to later on some of our what we're hoping to do now is try to link this with neural measures where we can track dynamically neurally where attention is and try to see if we can link that with these behavioral errors as well. But I'll wrap up that part for now. But if there are any questions about these feature perception part before I go on. Okay. Um, and again, I'm happy to take questions at the end as well. Okay, so in this next part, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about some of these other additional types of consequences that we might see. So in this first part, this was sort of our initial demonstration that, okay, when spatial attention is captured away by some distracting stimulus, you have more than just a disruption of spatial attention, that can also disrupt your ongoing feature perception. And so then we started thinking more deeply, well, what might be some of these other consequences that ripple across? And in particular, we got particularly interested in these attention and working memory interactions. And so this next part is work that was led by a former postdoc in my lab, Blair Dubé, and she's now faculty at Memorial University in Canada. And so Blair was really interested in these reciprocal interactions between attention and working memory. And so it's been known for a long time that the contents of working memory, and I'll talk in the visual domain here, so particularly about visual working memory, can bias attention. So if you're sort of holding something in working memory, that can bias what you pay attention to. But also, attention regulates what information is encoded into working memory. And so you have these reciprocal interactions where working memory and attention are both influencing each other. And so when Blair came to the lab several years back, she was particularly interested in what happens to this reciprocal attention working memory interplay during attentional capture and distraction. So I'll just briefly go through this first study, but I'm happy to talk more later. Also, I know a number of you guys are working memory people, and so this one may be of particular interest as well. But I'll try to do it briefly first, just so I can get to some of the EEG stuff at the end. So basically what Blair did in this task is same sort of task. There was first a search where people here were searching for a T stimulus among L's. And so they just have to find whichever one is the T and indicate whether it's upright or inverted. And then on some trials, there's a distracting stimulus, this white border that flashes around one of the other items. And so critically in this task, color was completely irrelevant to the task. They were looking for the T's and they could get distracted by other items. what we were interested in is what would happen, if you're distracted, if your attention gets captured over to this distracting one here, not only is this going to slow you down here, it does, for sure, but what Blair was interested in was, well, if your attention gets disrupted, might that actually disrupt those filters that are gating your working memory encoding? And so in this case, color is totally irrelevant to the task. So color should never be attended. And so color should just be filtered out. You shouldn't be remembering either consciously or even unconsciously encoding those colors because color is always just completely irrelevant to the task. But the question was, if you have on some trials this disruption of spatial attention, might that disrupt that gating to working memory and actually cause that irrelevant information, so the color around the distractor, um, that irrelevant color to be incidentally sort of encoded into working memory. And indeed, that's what she found. So we did this through the secondary task using working memory German capture and found that indeed these salient spatial distraction can disrupt the visual working memory filtering. So if you have an irrelevant distractor feature, that actually can intrude into working memory during capture, and then that can later drive your subsequent attention. And again, I'm happy to chat more about this cool study later. Um, but really, the one of the most striking things that came out of this was this filter disruption theory. And so this theory that Blair and I developed um, really goes further to say, okay, when you have this dynamic salient distraction, it can disrupt attentional filters, not only gating the current spatial focus of attention, but it also seems to disrupt filters gating working memory access. And so this then got us thinking further, well, if it's disrupting these non-spatial filters, these filters gating working memory access, might this filter disruption ripple even further? And might there be even other types of non-spatial attentional control filters that could be disrupted when you have this spatial task? So, so we decided to test this using what I'll consider a pretty old school fMRI study. So we decided to say, okay, well, what's a very non-spatial filter that we could look at? And so we thought, well, let's look at these category-tuned attentional filters. So this right here, hopefully you guys can see on your screen, these are hybrid face house images. So it's an image that is a hybrid of a face in a house. And what you can do is, I could tell you, okay, pay attention to the face in it. And you can almost feel like the face is sort of coming out a little higher contrast. Or if I say, okay, now pay attention to the house, you can hone in on the house. And so this is a way of you can shift your attention around in a non-spatial way because these are spatially overlapping. There's not spatial attention involved in the same way. So we can really look at your attentional focus to faces versus houses and ask how that's disrupted. The reason we use these faces and houses is because decades of research has shown that there are specific regions in the brain that can preferentially process face information and house information. And so we can use this as a tool because if someone is attending to the faces, you're going to see greater activity in the fusiform face area in the FFA. And if someone is attending houses, at a moment, you're going to see greater activity relatively in the PPA. And so you can use this by looking at FFA and PPA activity. You can use this to compute sort of on each trial what you can think of as an attentional filtering index. So how much someone is paying attention to the face versus the house. And so what we can do is develop a task where people are for several minutes supposed to be paying attention to the faces, and we can look at the attentional filtering, and then we can ask how that filtering index might be disrupted on trials where there's salient distraction. And the prediction of this filter disruption theory is that on no distractor trials, you should be good at filtering out the irrelevant stimulus. But if there's some spatial distraction that happens, and if indeed that does disrupt these filters, then you might see an increase in the neural processing of that task irrelevant category. So this is the way we did the task. So participants on each trial, they were doing a visual search task. So on each trial, four items would appear, and each of these items is a hybrid face and a house. So in all four quadrants, there's face information and house information. They would do blocks for several minutes at a time where they'd be told, okay, you're in a faces block. And so if they were in an attend faces block, then on each trial, they're going to focus on the face. They're going to stay fixated, but they're going to covertly focus on the face that's in this target square. And they're just doing a one back test comparing it. So is the face in this target same as the face that they just saw? So they're doing a one back test looking for these repeats in the target faces or on other, blocks on the houses. And then on some trials, there's a salient distractor. So a dashed line, importantly, just in the middle, early on in the trial, just abruptly onsets and disappears, capturing attention. And so again, the question is, not just would your spatial attention is going to be drawn here. The question is, if you were paying attention to the face here, when your attention is captured here, are you going to be processing the face over here, or is it going to disrupt that whole face house filter? So let me first show you. So these are what the fMRI data look like on these distractor absent trials. So on distractor absent trials, if you are attending, so in the FFA, you see stronger activity in the blocks where you're attending faces than houses, and in the PPA, you see the reverse. Um, Importantly, again, I want to mention there are both faces and houses on all of these trials. So this is purely just attention effect. The stimulus is identical. It's just whether they are attending to the face or attending to the house at that moment. To make things simpler, I'm just going to combine these. So this is basically the darker bar is now attending to the preferred stimulus. So faces in FFA versus and houses in PPA, and the lighter bar is the opposite. So the non-preferred stimulus. And so again, on distractor absent trials, you can see some nice attentional filtering there. There's a stronger activity, so you can see they're attending more to the preferred than the non-preferred stimulus. Then again, the question is what happens if a distracting stimulus appears elsewhere? Is it just going to process the same face, the face just in the other location, or is it going to break the filter? And indeed, it completely disrupts the filter. And so this spatial distraction is causing a momentary loss of control, so just on those trials, over that attentional filter. And so it's resulting in the selection and processing of non-target information that should be ignored. Um, and so I can show you this again. This is if we were to calculate that attentional filtering index. Each of these are individual participants. So we only had 14 subjects in this first experiment, but we had a lot of data for each participant. And so you can see that all 14 participants in the distractor absent are showing positive attentional filtering. And then when the salient spatial distractor, you see a reduction and actually even a reversal. Um, Full disclosure, we were not expecting the reversal. We thought that we would see a reduction here. We were surprised by the full reversal of it, and so we've gone in and done a bunch of additional experiments, many of which we're still looking into, looking at why the filter is reversed. But I think the main reason, and I think that is intuitively graspable as well, is that when the spatial filter is disrupted, it seems to be disrupting both the facilitation of the preferred and the suppression of the non-preferred. And so you get almost this like boomerang effect when they both get disrupted. But that's something we're still trying to explore a bit more, the filter reversal part. But regardless, we seem to see this really strong disruption effect. So when attention is captured by these salient distractors, we're seeing all these consequences. So we're seeing things like distorted feature perception, working memory intrusions, but also these broader failures of cognitive control and a disruption of these non-spatial neural filters. So things that should have been filtered out are now being disrupted. The irrelevant information is getting processed neurally and then encoded into working memory afterwards. Um, So, yes, any questions on that part so far? Okay. So, in the final part, I want to talk a little bit about some other directions that we're trying to take this in to really understand these filter disruptions and these dynamic interplay between the consequences of attention on perception and working memory. And really, even though in that last experiment I was showing you neural data, really we were using that as a tool to assess what's happening in the processing. And so um, not really getting at the neural mechanisms of it. And so ultimately, what we really want to be able to do is link these perceptual and memory distortions to underlying neural mechanisms. Um, and to try to track, because we're looking at these dynamic processes, it would be really nice if we can track how the neural representations are changing with dynamic attention, and then how that can impact these or produce these perceptual and memory distortions. And also, one of our goals is to try to use these neuroimaging techniques to uncover aspects we can't get at behaviorally, because everything that I've shown you producing these behavioral errors, you also have to have people making a behavioral response and doing a particular task. And sometimes that in and of itself can sort of cloud the processes that are going on underneath. So, another branch of my lab has really been focusing on advancing these different model-based neuroimaging tools across a variety of contexts, just to try to get our tools to a place where they could be helpful for this sort of question. Because really, when we think about having those goals and really wanting to be able to track this, none of the techniques that we really have so far are able to give us this satisfying combination of it. So we've been working on trying to push the limits with these different types of model-based neuroimaging tools to try to get these dynamic reconstructions or insight into the dynamic neural representations. And so what I'll share today, we've been doing this, pushing this on lots of different fronts. Um, One of the fronts that I think has been most successful so far for this question is a study that we did where we were looking at using EEG and trying to take advantage of the temporal dynamics of EEG to try to track what's being attended over time during shifts of attention. And this was led by a former grad student in my lab, Jung Chen. And so what we're doing is trying to say, okay, if people are doing this task where they have two items here and they can be shifting attention between the two items, can we not only, can we take the EEG activity and can we not only reconstruct which location, where someone is paying attention to at a given time, but also what are the contents of their attention? So, what features are they paying attention to over that? And to be able to link those time courses between spatial and feature attention. So for this task, we used an SSVEP paradigm, so a steady state visual evoked potential. I'll briefly walk you through the task. So subjects would always stay fixated on this cross, and they had two items in the periphery that were flickering both at 40 hertz. So for this case, we didn't do, if people are familiar with SSVEP, one standard way that you could say to tell like sort of where spatial attention is you could have these items flickering. Oops, trying to get my mouse back. You could have them flickering at different frequencies, and then you could frequency tag and see which frequency is higher. That can help you know which item someone's paying attention to, but that's not going to be useful if we are trying to say, well, we want to reconstruct what orientation or what color, for example, was in the focus of attention. And so, in order to do that, we wanted to have them flickering at the same frequency. So, we had one common neural signal, and then we were trying to pull out the feature information from that. So, both items are flickering. And so, they're doing a task where they're staying fixated, they're covertly attending. And so some subjects are told always attend to the purple item, other subjects are told always attend to the gold item. And so what this looks like is some trials are hold trials. So if you're a purple subject, then you're fixating and you're always paying attention to the purple item. And so you're going to covertly attend to the location of the purple item. The dashed lines are just here for reference. They weren't actually there for the participants. So they're covertly attending and they're attending the orientation of it. So they're supposed to be paying attention in their periphery to the purple item, and they're pressing a button every time the orientation slightly flickers. So they have to monitor the orientation of it over time. And then at the very end of the trial, they also have to report the final orientation that they saw. Um, so these would be hold trials. On other trials, at an unpredictable point in the middle of the trial, the items would switch colors. So now the purple item is the one on the left, and so they would have to shift their attention to this left item. And importantly, now before they were on this particular trial attending to this diagonal orientation. Now the orientation that they're monitoring is this more horizontal orientation. Um, and then what we input to our model is we input the SSVB power, so the EEG power at that 40 hertz frequency. And we train our model on the hold data. So we build models that we are training it on either the orientation or the location of the hold trials. And then we are testing it time point by time point on the shift trials. Okay. All right, so first I'll show you the reconstructions of attended orientation. And so I mentioned I didn't get into these details, but for orientation, we're using an inverted encoding model. So we're trying to reconstruct basically, not just say, was it 45, this, was it left or right, but we're trying to actually reconstruct what orientation someone was paying attention to at each point in time. So again, training it on the hold trials and then testing it on the shift. And so this is a plot. So to orient you, this is over time. These are aligned to the shift cue. So if you look at the first half here, this is a heat map of the reconstructed orientation. So this would be a trial where, let's say, they were attending to the left side first, and then they shifted to the right. So when they were attending to the left side, that original orientation is this black line here. So this is the orientation they were supposed to be attending to. And this is a heat map showing the reconstructed orientation. So if it's sort of focused in on that correct one, you can think of it as like a color Gaussian that's just been flattened. If there was no information about orientation, then this would just be a solid color throughout. So if you couldn't decode, if you couldn't reconstruct anything from it, it would be a common color. But here you can see that there is a pretty solid focus over the course of before the shift cue. You're successfully reconstructing the original orientation. And then after the shift cue, there's a brief delay where it's kind of ambiguous. But then after a bit of time, you're now successfully reconstructing that new orientation. This is another way of plotting this same data. So this is plotting the slope here. So basically, if you just take the peak and you take the slope at the peak, the slope being a measure of how well you're reconstructing. And so this is the slope at the initial, sorry for it's a little fuzzy, but basically you're seeing, significant decoding of the or reconstructing of the original location beforehand. And then after the shift, you see it coming up at the new attended location. And what I want to point out here is this cool part where, immediately after the shift, there's ambiguity. But there is a period of time where you seem to be reconstructing both the old location and the new one. So if you look here, there are like hot spots at the old location and the new one. And there seems to be some period where you get that before it narrows back in on the old location. And then I mentioned that one of the major things that we wanted to do with this was to then be able to link these dynamic feature representations with the spatial representation. And so this is now a time course of decoding of which location they were paying attention to. And so it's just plotted to be in the same way. So you can see before the shift, you can really nicely decode the original attended location. And then after the shift, initially, it's still decoding the original one because this is just backwards. You can imagine this coming down, oops, like this. And then over a few hundred milliseconds, you can now see it shift to be decoding the new one. And one of the cool things we can do in linking this time course is if we take this ambiguous period spatially. So this is the point in time where spatial attention is sort of not reliably on one location or the other. This is that ambiguous spatial one. If we look, that's the time period where we also see the ambiguous feature location, feature information. And so this is, there are lots of other things that can be done with this, but this seems to be a promising technique that's allowing us to track these rapid shifts and be able to try to combine and link these what the feature that someone is holding attention as a function of the spatial location. And so what we're hoping to do is, use this technique or some of the other ones we've been doing to actually now be able to apply that to these dynamic spatial attention and distraction scenarios to try to link, okay, if we can get accurate measures neurally at a given moment in time, if, you presented stimuli, can you link that to the behavioral errors that are occurring at those points in time? So stay tuned for that. But that's the direction that we are hoping to go with this technique. So in conclusion, at the very least, what we're seeing is that, attention, perception, and memory are really closely intertwined. I'd argue perhaps more than what most people had assumed in the past, such that when one of these is disrupted, particularly in this case, when spatial attention is disrupted, the consequences can ripple across these other types of cognitive processing. And so when we're considering scenarios like distraction, and in particular, if people are interested in like real world consequences and applications of distraction and what happens when we actually get distracted in the real world, maybe we need to think about more than just the spatial effects of getting distracted, that there might be broader consequences to distraction for perception and cognitive control and working memory as well. And I think the other big picture takeaway is that it's really important to consider that static and dynamic visual perception might not be the same. I think, many of us, myself included, like majority of our work is done like, okay, let's treat, these processes as a static snapshot. So you are attending to one location and we see what happens. But the real world is dynamic. And so often there are complexities that can't be fully realized if you're just doing experiments that are in these static contexts. So I think, what I've showed you are some of the consequences or costs of dynamic perception. One of the other interesting things we've been doing is sometimes dynamic cases actually can have advantages as well. And so we've shown this with some eye movement stuff as well, that sometimes counterintuitively being in a dynamic context actually helps you integrate more. And so these dynamic scenarios can cause extra consequences. They can also cause extra benefits. And so I think it's really important to think about these dynamic scenarios. And when we're thinking about interactions between different processes, really not only considering the static part. Okay, so on that note, thank you guys for your attention, and thanks to my lab and our funding sources.